My name is Rowena Hallberg, and I attended my own funeral. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. I always imagined death would be quieter. Not for me, of course, I mean for the people around me. I thought if I ever passed, it would be soft. A gentle sigh into the dark, some scattered tears, maybe even a laugh over an old playbill or a story from my time as a director. But what I witnessed was a production lavish, strategic, and utterly soulless. 3 months earlier, I began to suspect something was off. I wasn't in the best health. My arthritis was cruel in the mornings, and I had a minor stroke the year before. My eldest Gregory began showing up more often. His visits used to be rare, but now he came weekly, bringing groceries, fluffing my pillows, helping with finances. Too helpful. He started asking about my estate planning, about the will, about my passwords. And my daughter Vivienne, she who once called the theater your dusty shrine, was suddenly interested in family heirlooms. One afternoon, I pretended to nap in my sitting room. The sun streamed through the windows, warming my face as I listened to them in the kitchen. My name floated through the air once, then again. She won't last the year, Vivienne said. The doctors said the minor stroke was a warning. She's barely coherent anymore. Gregory chimed in. We need to act before it gets messy. She doesn't even remember who has power of attorney. She continued. We can just prepare it all, quietly. The air left my lungs. I had been directing plays for over 40 years. I knew how to fake a swoon, how to read silence, and how to feel an audience's breath change. What I felt in that moment was not a scene. It was betrayal, bone deep and bitter. I didn't confront them. That would have been loud, and loud was never my style. Instead, I began watching, listening, recording. I had a neighbor, Theo, who once worked in cybersecurity before retirement. In exchange for cooking his diabetic meals twice a week, he helped me install hidden cameras and microphones. One in the piano room, one in the kitchen light fixture, one in the vase next to my old awards. Within 2 weeks, I had more than enough. They talked about preparation in abstract terms, finalizing paperwork, simplifying transition, and the one that made my stomach turn, releasing her pain. Then one night I heard it. A phone call from Gregory to someone at the local registry. I've got the attending physician's signature ready. We'll file her death within 72 hours. Natural causes. Everything looks legitimate. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were arranging it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I called Theo. You need to vanish, he said immediately. Make it look real. No warning. No footprints. Just disappear. I nodded. 2 nights later, I packed a small suitcase with essentials. My late husband's watch, my old passport, and every flash drive Theo had compiled for me. At 2:47, I walked out of my home for the last time at least, as Rowena Hallberg, the fragile old woman her children wanted buried. The next morning, Vivienne would find my bed empty, the sheets still warm. She'd call the police. Gregory would shed a few performative tears. They'd fabricate a story about memory loss, about a frail mother who wandered into the woods or the sea or God knows where. What they didn't know was that I had booked a single-room apartment under a pseudonym in a small artist community 2 towns away. A place with no cameras, no visitors, and no questions. For 2 weeks I watched the news. And then it happened. Renowned theater director presumed dead after disappearance. Family mourns legacy of Rowena Hallberg. A life devoted to the stage ends in mystery. My heart thudded not in fear but in something colder. Calculated. A cue had been given and now the scene was in motion. I wasn't dead. But the woman I had been to them, the trusting, gentle mother, she was gone. And the next act would be mine to direct. The day of my funeral arrived exactly 3 weeks after my disappearance. They held it at St. Matthias Church, the one with the long white aisle and stained glass windows that catch morning light, like stage lights catching tears. I had directed a memorial play there once a lifetime ago. How poetic that my last performance would unfold on the very same stage. I sat 2 pews from the back, draped in black, with a veil that brushed my chin. The woman beside me smelled like rose lotion and grief. She didn't know me. That was the point. The program said, Celebration of Life. Rowena Hallberg, 1949, 2024. There was a photo on the front. Me younger, standing in front of the old Lincoln Theater, arms outstretched, like I was gathering the whole world into a standing ovation. Gregory took the podium first. My son, 49 years old, thick hair like his father's, and the polished voice of a man who thought he'd won. My mother was difficult in her later years, he said with the hint of a chuckle that made my stomach turn. But she loved deeply. She gave everything to the theater, to her family, and we were lucky to be her children. A lie. A rehearsed one. He sniffed, dabbed at dry eyes, then told a story about how I used to tape handwritten notes to his lunch bags in elementary school. Something about Shakespeare quotes and bad jokes. He was winning them over. Vivienne was worse. Far worse. She was an artist, yes, but also a mother who knew how to love with silence. She said, her voice smooth as silk. She didn't always say what she felt, but we knew. We always knew. I wanted to scream, to rip off the veil and walk to the front and say, "Did you know I was alive when you filed the certificate? Did you know I watched you practice that speech 3 times in the hallway mirror before you drove here?" But I stayed seated, still. Then came the moment that cracked me open, not with pain, but with icy clarity. The coffin. Closed. Draped in white lilies and a velvet blanket. There was no viewing. No body. Of course not. There was no body to view. But the priest still said his lines. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The choir sang a low, somber version of Abide With Me, and guests sniffled and whispered condolences as if they were living through a tragedy instead of staging one. And there, row 5, was my sister, Esther. She was the only one who didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared forward with arms crossed, her lips a single thin line. Esther had always been the one to speak her mind, even when it scorched the room. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the fallout after my husband died, but I knew that look. Suspicion. When the ceremony ended, I slipped out the back with the quiet shuffle of the forgotten. But not before I saw them smile, Gregory and Vivienne. Not wide grins, just satisfied curves at the corner of their mouths as they hugged guests goodbye. There was relief behind their tears. Relief that their plan had worked. They'd filed the will, claimed the accounts, moved into the estate I had lived in for 32 years. And not once did either of them express confusion that my body was never found. I went back to the apartment that night and poured a glass of wine with shaking hands. It was too early for revenge, but not too early to prepare the next act. I contacted Theo. We need a timeline, I told him, and a list of names. Everyone who helped them push the paperwork. Over the next week, I compiled everything. I accessed emails, court filings, even bank transfers from Gregory's and Vivienne's accounts. They had moved fast, like rats racing through a maze they thought they'd memorized. But they didn't know the final door belonged to me. The will they used was a copy I had intentionally planted 6 months earlier, a decoy. My real will, notarized, signed, and locked in Theo's fireproof safe, painted a very different picture. One that left almost everything to charity. And to Esther, the children got nothing. But for now they didn't know that. For now they believed they had won. And I intended to let them feel that high just long enough to ensure their fall would be unforgettable. I was ready to start writing again. Not plays. A plan. A scene. A return. Because the dead don't speak. But I would make sure they listened. The strange thing about being declared dead is how quickly the world adjusts. No one calls. No one writes. No one questions. Your name turns to past tense in people's mouths. And in that silence you can hear everything. I kept to myself in the tiny flat above the bakery. The scent of sourdough and burnt sugar wafted through the floorboards each morning. I wore a wig when I went out, short auburn with a fringe that made my face look softer, younger even. I adopted a slight limp, changed my walk, bought cheap, shapeless clothing, and no one suspected a thing. But I didn't waste the stillness. Every day I reviewed the footage. The files Theo had recovered from my home surveillance system were damning. One clip showed Gregory practicing my signature poorly. Another captured Vivienne in my study whispering instructions over the phone to a probate lawyer. She used phrases like time-sensitive expedited certification, and she wouldn't want to be kept alive that way. I labeled every file, dated it, created a timeline of the conspiracy. I watched my life be unmade on screen. Then I turned my attention to the estate. It had been in my name since my husband passed. 32 rooms, red brick exterior, white pillars, a wrought iron gate with roses that bloomed wildly in May. I had given up my life in theater to restore that home. Its bones were strong, its heart old. And now Vivian lived there, redecorating in cold marble and matte gold. Theo helped me tap into the smart home system. Cameras, door sensors, heating logs. She didn't even change the access codes. I watched as she threw a party one night, guests in cocktail dresses, clinking glasses in the ballroom. Gregory made a toast in front of the fireplace, standing right where I once scattered my husband's ashes. To freedom, he said. To new beginnings. I laughed, out loud. It startled me how joyful I sounded, because they thought this was the final act. But the curtain had only just risen. The next step was Esther. I hadn't spoken to my sister since the Christmas I accused her of stealing from our father's coin collection. She hadn't. I was wrong. But pride is a hard prison to escape, and I served my time in silence. Now I needed her, not for revenge, but for truth. I called from a payphone outside a diner. She picked up on the third ring. "Hello, Esther," I said. "It's Rowena." A beat. No gasp. No scream. Just a quiet, "You've got some explaining to do." She met me that night at an abandoned train station we used to sneak into as teenagers. She wore a gray trench coat and held a flask I knew was filled with black coffee and bourbon. "Some things never changed." "I knew something was off," she said, handing me the flask. "Didn't believe a word of that eulogy. Gregory always was a snake." "I need your help," I replied. "And your forgiveness." She raised an eyebrow. "Depends on what for." "For letting the distance grow so wide that I didn't know who my children became." Her expression softened. Over the next hour, I told her everything. She listened, occasionally cursed. Once kicked a stone so hard it bounced off a rusted rail. Then she looked at me and said the most powerful words I'd heard since this started. "You want to come back from the dead. Let me produce it." I blinked. "Produce," she grinned. "You directed plays for 40 years, Ro. But I've run 6 community theater fundraisers, 3 political campaigns, and 1 ex-husband's nervous breakdown. Let me be your stage manager." I smiled. The next day, she brought me a burner phone and a list of trusted names. Old friends, theater contacts, people with quiet influence and loud connections, people who owed favors, people who believed in spectacle. We didn't need guns. We had timing. We didn't need threats. We had truth in cameras. The goal wasn't just to expose them. It was to make sure that everyone, friends, family, estate attorneys, and public trustees, knew what they did. We planned the reveal like a play. Act 1, the return. Act 2, the reckoning. Act 3, the decision. But before any of that, I had to become someone else. I changed my hair again, sharper, dyed it deep chestnut with silver streaks. I got glasses I didn't need, bought a tailored navy suit. I learned to walk like I had power in my bones, not frailty. And then I visited my old lawyer, Miles Dunhaven. He was the one who originally helped me draft my true will, the one Gregory and Vivian never found. He had called once after my death, left a voicemail that simply said, "I don't buy it. Call me if you're not dead." I walked into his office without an appointment. He looked up from his desk, blinked, and slowly stood. "Rowena." "In the flesh," I said. "Let's ruin some lives." "And Miles." He just smiled. "I assume you're not here for small talk," Miles said, pouring 2 glasses of something dark and expensive. "How long have you been undead?" "Long enough to know they've already moved in," I replied, taking the glass. "And redecorated. The floral wallpaper is gone." He winced. That wallpaper was iconic. We sat. Miles, still tall and dapper in his gray suit, crossed his legs and steepled his fingers. "I want to hear the whole thing. From your mouth. No gaps." So I told him everything. The whispers behind the wall. The forged documents. The missing persons reports that somehow fast-tracked into a death certificate without ever finding a body. The funeral, the will, the assets, the lies. I showed him the footage from the hidden cameras. The audio of Gregory and Vivian discussing how I was slipping ready to go and how a peaceful end wouldn't raise questions. I played the clip where Gregory practiced my signature on the revised will. I showed him the time-stamped screen captures from the smart home system that proved they were already moving property before I was legally declared dead. When I finished, Miles leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low whistle. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "Criminal fraud. Worse, this is public betrayal. The kind that sticks. And the kind that needs a stage." I nodded. "That's why I'm here." We spent the next week preparing the pieces. Miles filed a quiet legal complaint not against Gregory or Vivian, but against the law firm that notarized the fraudulent will. That would be the first domino. Then he reactivated my estate ownership under my maiden identity, Rowena Westwick, through a trust I'd forgotten I even had. That trust now legally owned everything. The estate, my theater royalties, even the antique jewelry Vivian had already flaunted at the charity gala. And speaking of that gala, Esther and I had circled the date weeks ago. The annual Hallberg Foundation fundraiser held every fall in my honor. This year was meant to be the grandest yet, a tribute to my legacy. How appropriate. Tickets had been sold, invitations sent, donors wooed. Gregory was to give the keynote speech. Vivian would introduce the unveiling of the Rowena Hallberg Artistic Integrity Grant. They would stand on stage, smile, and accept applause in my name. And then I would walk in, unannounced, uninvited, undead. But that night, back in the apartment above the bakery, I sat in front of a dusty mirror and asked myself a question I hadn't dared consider until then. What if they truly believe they did the right thing? What if in some warped corner of their hearts they thought this was mercy, or efficiency, or love in the only way they understood it? I looked in the mirror at the woman with new hair, clear eyes, and trembling hands. "I don't want to destroy them," I whispered. "I want them to understand. Because revenge isn't always rage. Sometimes it's revelation, and sometimes it's a mirror." The day of the gala arrived crisp and cool, with golden leaves painting the sidewalk in shades of fire. I wore black. Not mourning black, but power black. Structured. Clean. My hair was pinned high, the streaks of silver visible like thunderclouds on a night sky. My pearl earrings were the only piece I wore from my former life. I walked in through the service entrance. Theo and Esther were already inside. Miles too disguised as a donor. Cameras were positioned, some professional, some hidden. Every angle covered. Audio live. The stage set. I stood in the hallway just out of sight of the ballroom doors. Vivian's voice echoed through the speakers. "And tonight we honor the memory of a woman who taught us that art was never about fame. It was about truth." My mother, Rowena Hallberg, was the heart of this foundation. I stepped forward. Security moved, but Miles held up his badge. "She's expected," he said. A lie, but a useful one. I opened the ballroom doors. 100 heads turned. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Vivian dropped her note cards. Gregory's mouth hung open. A photographer lowered his camera as if afraid he'd caught something forbidden. And then I spoke. "Forgive me. I wasn't aware the dead needed an RSVP." The room gasped. Vivian turned ghostly pale. Gregory took one step backward as if retreating from a specter. But I was no ghost. I was the storm. I walked to the stage with a grace I hadn't felt in years. Not since curtain calls. Not since standing ovations. Vivian stammered, How this isn't." I took the microphone, and I began. "Good evening. My name is Rowena Hallberg. You may know me from the obituary my children wrote the funeral they staged, or the estate they divided like scavengers at a feast. But I didn't die. I watched. I listened. And I learned just how far love bends before it breaks. Silence. No one clapped. No one moved. Not yet. I didn't come here tonight for revenge," I continued. "I came to reclaim my name, my truth, my legacy. And I brought evidence, witnesses, and something far more powerful than wealth." I looked straight at my children. Shame. Then I stepped down from the podium. Miles stepped forward and handed them the folder. Legal, binding, undeniable. Gregory reached for it with shaking hands. Vivienne stared at me as if trying to will me into disappearing. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. The hush that followed my final word was not empty. It was charged. The kind of silence right before a storm breaks open where people hold their breath, afraid that even exhaling might shift the balance. Gregory opened the folder Miles handed him. His hands trembled like a leaf in wind. As he skimmed the contents, signed affidavits, financial ledgers, footage, transcripts, and the notarized original will, I saw his jaw tighten. He looked up once at Vivienne, who was frozen like porcelain ready to crack. The first sound that broke the silence wasn't applause or outrage. It was a gasp. From a woman near the back, one of the foundation's legacy donors. She covered her mouth, her eyes wide. Then came the whispers. She's alive. They staged it. Did she just say, funeral? The room was turning slowly. As if waking from a shared hallucination, I stood off to the side now, no longer the spectacle, just the truth. Gregory stepped forward, holding the folder as if it might burn him. This is some kind of performance. A trick. I tilted my head. You of all people should know, Gregory. I retired from performance. But you never stopped pretending. Vivienne finally moved. She descended the stage steps, her heels clicking on the marble floor like gunshots. You don't understand, she hissed just loud enough for the front row to hear. You were getting worse. You didn't remember things. We were protecting you. Protecting me from what? I asked. From my own mind. Or from the inconvenience of your inheritance being delayed. I did what I had to, she whispered. We needed to secure the assets. There it was. The truth stripped bare. No flowers, no eulogies, just greed clean and cold. You didn't need to fake my death for that, I replied. You just needed to ask me to disappear. She blinked once. Would you have? I looked her dead in the eye. No. Her nostrils flared. Behind her, the press had arrived. I saw the flashing lights of local news crews. It was public now, irrevocably so. Miles stepped forward and handed a second folder to the event organizer. This includes the revocation of the fraudulent will, the reinstatement of Mrs. Hallberg's living status, and her intent to pursue civil and criminal charges. The man, a nervous type with a too-tight bow tie, nodded numbly, then turned to the crowd. We'll take a brief intermission, he stammered. Please help yourself to refreshments. Half the guests stood. A few drifted toward the doors. Some just stood there, stunned. Esther approached me. She didn't say good job. She didn't have to. She just squeezed my arm and whispered, "Curtain call, sister." And for a brief moment I felt lighter. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. I turned back to Gregory and Vivienne, who stood like twin statues, cracked, crumbling. I'm not pressing charges for the sake of punishment. I said loud enough for the cameras now trained on me. I'm pressing charges because what you did is a disease. And I won't let it spread. Gregory scoffed. You think this makes you a hero? You faked your own disappearance. I disappeared, I said slowly, because it was the only way to learn the truth. And I returned, because I still believe people can change if they're forced to look in the mirror. Vivienne was breathing hard now. We're your children. How could you do this to us? I walked up to her, leaned in close and whispered, You did it to yourselves. She flinched. Then, with a grace that could only come from decades of stage blocking, I turned away and walked out of the ballroom. Past the cameras, past the whispers, past the ruined image of a family that had already buried me once. Outside, the air was crisp with autumn and clean of illusion. I took a deep breath and looked at the night sky. Theo was waiting by the car. Well, he asked. Was it everything you hoped? No, I said, getting in. It was better. That night, we returned to the apartment and celebrated not with champagne, but with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. Vivienne and Gregory would face hearings. They'd deny spin plead. But it was all on record now. The footage, the falsified death filings, the estate maneuvering. I had made sure the truth was no longer something they could bury, because I'd already climbed out of the grave they dug for me. And the best part, I hadn't even gotten to the final scene yet. A week after the gala, the headlines were merciless. Heiress hoax. Children staged mother's death to seize estate. Rowena Hallberg returns from the grave with evidence. Truth theater and treason. A family scandal unfolds. Every outlet from local news to national talk shows wanted an interview. I declined them all. I wasn't doing this to become a viral sensation. Fame was a candle I'd already burned through once in my life. I wasn't chasing light now. I was chasing justice. Gregory and Vivian, however, ran straight to damage control. Their lawyers issued carefully worded statements. They claimed I was mentally unwell, that the documents were misunderstood, that it was a miscommunication between siblings during a time of emotional stress. They tried to bury the truth again, but this time the grave was too shallow. The state opened an investigation. My previous death certificate was declared invalid. The attending physician who'd signed off was suspended pending a full inquiry. The law firm that had notarized the fake will had its license temporarily revoked. Even the funeral home director who signed the cremation release without a body was suddenly nowhere to be found. The web was unraveling, but none of that brought me peace. What haunted me more than the betrayal was the silence. Not a word from my children, no apology, no confrontation, not even anger. I expected rage, denial, something to remind me that they had once been mine. But all I got was absence, and in that void I began to ask questions that made me ache. Was it me? Did I raise them to believe people are disposable? That legacy matters more than presence. I kept going through old photographs. Gregory at 9 holding his first violin. Vivienne in her first ballet slippers smiling up at me with her toothy grin. Letters they wrote from camp. Mother's Day drawings with crooked hearts. What happened? Where did I lose them? Did I spend too many nights in rehearsals chasing applause from strangers while they learned love meant waiting quietly? Or was it something simpler? That wealth had simply seduced them, erased the lines between love and opportunity. I didn't know anymore, and yet I still couldn't stop what I'd started. Esther, ever the anchor, reminded me of that. "You're not doing this for closure," she said one night as we sat on my tiny balcony watching clouds creep across the moon. "You're doing it so the next mother who disappears gets found." I nodded. Or doesn't disappear at all. The hearings began in early December. I attended every session, never spoke. Just sat in the second row, silent and visible. A living ghost. A reminder that I still had breath and that every word they spoke would echo back to me. Gregory's defense was as rehearsed as any monologue he delivered at family dinners. She wasn't well. We didn't know how to help her. We thought, if we had control, we could make sure she was safe. Vivian's strategy was different. Cold. Clinical. I acted on the advice of professionals. I believed my mother was a danger to herself. The paperwork was expedited, not forged. We acted in what we thought were her best interests. But the evidence crushed their narrative. Emails, audio recordings, the surveillance videos. One clip in particular sealed their fate. It was a video from the kitchen days before I disappeared. Gregory speaking to Vivienne. "If we wait, we risk losing it all. She's unpredictable. This way it's clean. The world will move on." Vivienne's response. "So let's move first." No interpretation needed. The judge didn't rule that day. That would come later. But the room knew. So did the press. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon into a sea of microphones and shouted questions. I didn't answer any. I didn't need to. I walked straight to the car and closed the door behind me. Inside, Esther reached over and held my hand. We didn't speak for a while. Then I asked, "Did I ever tell you why I chose the theater?" She smiled softly. "Because you loved stories." "No," I said. "Because on stage everything is seen, every lie, every truth. The audience may not know what's coming, but they feel it. That tension, that shift, that justice." She nodded. "And what's this?" "This," I said, "is the final act before the curtain falls." The ruling came on a cold gray Thursday. I remember the way the courthouse smelled like damp paper and old wood polish. People think justice arrives like thunder, loud, sudden, divine. But often it's quieter, slower, like a pen scratching on legal parchment while the guilty squirm behind their ties. I sat on the left side of the courtroom, same seat as every previous hearing, my back straight and my face unreadable. Vivienne didn't look at me. Gregory did, but only once. Just a glance when the judge cleared his throat and began to read the ruling. It wasn't regret in his eyes. It wasn't even fear. It was recognition. For the first time since this began, he saw me, not as an obstacle, not as a memory, but as a mother and a force. The judgment was long and precise. The court found both of them guilty of fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud a living person of their assets. But what made the room shift was the phrase the judge used to close. The defendants buried their mother not with earth, but with silence, lies, and greed. And yet she rose not to punish but to reveal. This court recognizes the truth and grants her full restoration of identity, assets, and reputation. Applause isn't allowed in court, but someone clapped, just once, sharp and deliberate. Then silence again. As we exited, reporters swarmed like bees. I walked slowly through them, the cold wind catching the edge of my coat like a curtain lifting. One of them shouted, "Ms. Hellberg, will you forgive your children?" I paused, turned, and said, "Ask me after they apologize." Esther was waiting by the steps. She held out my cane not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of the woman I'd once pretended to be. Fragile, invisible. I took it. Back at the apartment, I made tea. The old-fashioned way, loose leaves, ceramic pot, tiny sugar cubes my grandmother used to use. Esther was flipping through news channels. Gregory and Vivienne's faces were everywhere, pixelated then sharp. Their statements dissected their legacy collapsing. "They'll never live this down," she said, not unkindly. "I didn't want them ruined," I murmured. "I just wanted them to stop pretending I didn't exist." That night, I sat down and began writing letters. One to Gregory, one to Vivienne. Not for reconciliation, for record. I told them how I used to watch them sleep when they were little, how I once stayed up all night sewing sequins on a Halloween costume Vivienne had begged for. How I played Gregory's first recital tape so many times, the cassette wore thin. I told them I remembered the smell of their skin when they were babies, that I remembered their kindness before it became ambition, their laughter before it became calculation. And I ended each letter with the same line: "I am still here if you ever want to see me, not my money." I didn't send the letters. Not yet. They weren't ready. Maybe they never would be. But one day when the noise quieted and the house was empty, I hoped they'd feel the silence and miss the one voice they once tried to silence. Me. I returned to the estate 2 days later. It was exactly as I remembered, and nothing like I remembered. The furniture was sterile, the walls blank. It smelled like fresh paint and loss. I walked through each room, slowly running my fingers along surfaces that had once been mine. I paused in the study where my late husband's reading chair sat in the wrong corner. I moved it back, sat down, closed my eyes, and breathed. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't performing. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't surviving. I was simply living. The phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something in me shifted. I picked it up. It was Miles. "You're trending again," he said, his voice half exhausted, half amused. "I don't even know what that means." I laughed. "It means people are calling you the comeback queen of the year. Some producer in L.A. wants to option your story." I rolled my eyes. "Of course they do. You interested?" I stared out the window where the roses were beginning to bloom again. "No," I said. "Let someone else tell their truth. I've lived mine." Then I hung up and smiled. The world could tell its stories. I'd keep writing mine, just not for a stage. For me, spring returned with a kind of defiance. The cherry blossoms outside the estate burst into bloom as if nothing, no trial, no scandal, no betrayal had ever happened. Nature has a way of reminding you life moves on. Whether you're ready or not, I wasn't ready. But I was moving. I reopened my garden first. It had been let go, of course. Overgrown and boxed in by Vivienne's minimalist landscaping crew who preferred stone to soil. But the earth remembered me. The tulip bulbs I planted years ago were still there, sleeping deep, waiting. Like I had been, I hired an older gardener named Marcus, a man of few words and gentle hands. He didn't ask questions. He just showed up with gloves and silence pruning back the dead to make room for the living. One morning, he found me sitting in the dirt with my knees in the mud talking to a rose bush that hadn't bloomed in years. "You talk to them like they understand," he said, not mocking, just curious. "They do," I said. "They just don't interrupt." He nodded and got back to work. That became my rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons with Esther, evenings in my reading chair. I made no plans beyond the next hour. No visions of vengeance, no meetings with lawyers. The final act was over, and yet, something lingered. I kept expecting closure to feel louder, a celebratory feeling, the grand finale where the villain is vanquished and the heroine stands triumphant. But life as always was subtler than fiction, and more complicated. A letter arrived one Tuesday, thick envelope, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was familiar, angular, controlled. "Gregory, Mother, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I want you to, but I saw the footage, the one in the kitchen. I forgot you still had cameras. I forgot how much of your life was still yours. I didn't think we were hurting you. I thought we were finishing something you didn't have the strength to finish." That's what I told myself. But after watching your face at the gala, I knew we buried more than a name. I don't expect forgiveness. I wouldn't believe it if it came. But I needed you to know that I remember your voice. And it's louder now than it's ever been. Gee, I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't clutch it to my chest like a happy ending. I just read it, twice, then folded it and slid it into a leather-bound journal I'd started keeping again. Not for publishing, for remembering. That night, I returned to my study, lit a fire, made tea, and pulled out the real will, my will, the one no one had tampered with. I read it slowly. The pages were aged but firm. It had always been simple. Most of the estate to charity, a sizable trust for Esther, and a letter of explanation to my children. But now it felt unfinished. I opened a fresh page, and I began to write, not to erase them, but to give them something far more haunting. A second chance. I rewrote the clauses. I set conditions not of wealth, but of humility. If either child chose to make amends in tangible, sustained ways through service, through care, through presence, they would receive a share, not a reward, a reconciliation. And if not, they would still be remembered, but not as heirs, as warnings. By midnight, I finished the draft. Esther came in wrapped in her robe holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "You're writing again?" she said. I nodded. "Letters or laws?" "Both." She smiled. "Good. You always had a way with endings." I looked at the flickering fire. "Not this time," I said. "This time I'm writing beginnings. Because survival is not the final scene. Living is, and I was finally doing that." It was a Tuesday afternoon when the second letter arrived. This one wasn't from Gregory. It was from Vivienne. I recognized her handwriting instantly, elegant, practiced, like the calligraphy classes I once paid for when she was 12, and obsessed with old Victorian journals. The envelope was pressed with faint perfume, the same lilac scent she used as a teenager. Memory is strange that way. It doesn't just return. It blooms. Inside was a folded card, not lined, not ruled. Just white space and a few words. "I don't know how to face someone who watched me bury them, but I still remember your lullabies." Bikhi. That was it. No signature, no date. Just the wound gently opened but not yet dressed. I placed it beside Gregory's letter in the leathered journal, unsure of whether to feel relief or sorrow. A part of me wanted to call her immediately, scream, cry, do something. But another part, the part of me that had waited patiently through every betrayal, knew better. Healing doesn't answer the door just because someone knocks. It waits until they come back with open hands. I let the letter rest. That night, I walked through the estate slowly without shoes, letting the wooden floors creak beneath my feet. I paused in the kitchen where so many whispered conspiracies had once unfolded. The walls had been repainted, but I could still sense the ghost of my absence. I boiled water, made chamomile tea, and stared at the phone. I didn't call. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and clicked on the folder labeled Rowena Archive. It was a collection of all my old plays, interviews, photographs, and a handful of unreleased scripts I'd written in my 50s and never had the courage to stage. There, tucked deep inside, was one script I hadn't seen in decades: The Return. It was an unfinished one-woman show I had started years ago, long before any of this unfolded. The story was loosely autobiographical, a tale of a woman who disappeared from her own life only to return and find herself a stranger in the world she once built. I opened it, blinking at the faded text. And then I started typing. It came fast, like floodwater breaching a dam. The new words weren't bitter. They weren't laced with revenge or regret. They were reflective, human. The woman in the play didn't scream when she returned. She didn't tear down walls or torch bridges. She waited, listened, and then on the final page she simply said, "You cannot inherit a mother. You can only love her while she's alive." I wrote for hours. The fire crackled behind me. The tea went cold beside my hand. My fingers ached from typing. But when I finished, I sat back and whispered something into the quiet. Let this be the last act I ever need to write. 2 weeks later, I staged a private reading at the old Lincoln Theater. It had been closed for renovation since before my trial. But the new owner, an old student of mine, agreed to lend it to me for one night. Just friends, family if they dared. Esther sat front row, tears already glistening before I said a word. Marcus the gardener came too, surprisingly dapper in a pressed shirt and old tweed blazer. Miles was there, of course, arms folded, eyes intent, like he was watching a courtroom again. I walked on stage slowly. No spotlight, no makeup, just me. And I read. The play flowed from my lips like breath. There were moments I almost choked, others where I paused too long, letting silence stretch like string between notes. But when I reached the final line, something in me settled. You cannot inherit a mother. You can only love her while she's alive. And then I looked up. They were both there, standing in the back row, half shadowed by the open theater door. Gregory, Vivienne. They didn't clap. They didn't cry. They just stood still, staring. And I nodded. Not as an invitation, as acknowledgement. A single line between us, fragile, drawn in chalk but real. Afterward, they were gone. They didn't approach me, didn't speak, but I didn't need them to. They had come. That was the beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. I never imagined peace would feel like this. Not triumphant, not complete, just possible. Days passed with an odd kind of stillness. Not the stillness of grief or isolation, but the stillness of air before morning rain, the kind you sit with quietly because you've stopped expecting storms. After the reading, life folded back into its gentle rhythms. I tended to the garden, wrote letters to no one in particular, baked pies I didn't need just to fill the house with something warm. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic knock on the door. But every morning I found myself waking without dread, without ache, until the envelope came. This one wasn't handwritten. It was formal. A law firm, one I didn't recognize. Inside, a letter on expensive watermarked stationery announced that Vivienne and Gregory had relinquished their rights to my estate. No legal battle, no appeals, no conditions. Just this line: we are returning what we tried to steal, not because we lost it, but because we finally understood what it cost. No signature, just the initials, G and V. And that was when I cried, not for the loss, but for the moment it stopped mattering. Esther found me in the reading room, holding the letter, tears streaking down my cheeks. No apology, she asked softly. No, I said. But I don't need one. Are you sure? I smiled. When people give you back something they were never meant to take, that's an apology. They just don't have the courage to say it out loud. She nodded, then sat beside me. So what will you do now? I looked out the window. The garden was blooming. The tulips had arrived early this year. Live, I said, finally, without pretending. We decided to open the estate again, not as a home, but as a refuge. Esther and I founded the Hallberg House, a creative retreat for women over 60 who had been silenced, discarded, or underestimated. Writers, painters, former teachers, widows, dreamers who'd tucked their desires into drawers and forgotten where they left the key. Word spread faster than I expected. Within months, we had applications from across the country. Women who had stories to tell, lives to rewrite, hands to hold. One of our first residents was Miriam, a 72-year-old who once wrote for a newspaper, but was forced into early retirement when her editor told her, "No one wants the wisdom of women with soft skin and old bones." She arrived carrying a stack of yellowed poems and left with a published chapbook. Another was Felicia, a former science teacher whose daughter had tried to place her in a care home against her will. She painted wildflowers in acrylic, and in the evenings played jazz on a borrowed piano until the whole house hummed. The estate had never been livelier, nor had I. One evening, while closing the gate after a long day of planting, I saw them. Gregory, Vivienne. They stood outside the gate, not dressed for drama. No lawyers, no press. Just two people who once tried to bury their mother and were now standing in the shadow of the life she had grown without them. I didn't move. I waited. Gregory stepped forward first. "We're not here to fix anything," he said. Vivian added, "We just wanted to see it. What you turned it into." I looked at them. Not with anger. Not with expectation. Just with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've stood at the edge of being erased. I unlocked the gate. Pushed it open. "You can come in," I said, "but you don't get to call it home." They didn't flinch. They nodded, and entered not as heirs, but as visitors. That night, I sat with Esther in the garden. "You think they'll ever really change?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied. "But that's not my story to write anymore." The stars began to emerge one by one without ceremony, and somewhere deep in the house someone started playing music. A soft jazz tune drifted through the windows. I closed my eyes. Let it wash over me. Because after everything, death, betrayal, resurrection, I was still here. Alive, unburied, unbroken, and finally fully mine. We added a plaque to the front gate of the Hallberg house in early summer. Esther insisted on it. "People need to know what this place means," she said. The plaque read, "The Hallberg house. For every woman told her story ended long ago. This is where it begins again." People stopped to read it every day. Some took photos. Some just stood there silently, their fingers brushing across the words, as if they were touching something they'd lost long ago. I never imagined I'd become a symbol, not for revenge, but for reclamation. There was a time not too long ago when my life belonged to other people. My children, the press, the estate lawyers. I was the subject of headlines, the punchline to gossip, the cautionary tale whispered across brunch tables. "She came back from the dead," they'd say wide-eyed. But death wasn't the tragedy. The forgetting was. I remember one night, just after we opened our third residency cycle, I received a letter from a woman named Clarissa. She was 84 and living in Idaho. Her son had taken her car keys, her name off the deed to her house, and moved her into a room above his garage for her safety. She wrote, "I saw your story on the news. You reminded me I'm not just a body waiting to fade. I'm still a woman, still a storm, still someone." She signed it. "Clarissa Kingsley, future resident of Hallberg House. Watch me." I read that line over and over. Watch me. It echoed in my ribs for days. And I realized something no courtroom, no inheritance, no letter from my children could give me. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what rises because you stayed. The house was full now, 12 women from all walks of life. There was always something happening. Someone baking, someone writing, someone crying, someone laughing so loud it shook the old walls. One of them, Martha, a former midwife, began leading sunrise yoga in the orchard. Esther and I joined once. We both fell over trying to hold a warrior pose and laughed so hard our sides ached. I hadn't laughed like that in years. We started building an archive, not of paperwork, of voices. Each resident recorded her story unedited, unfiltered, unashamed. We kept them in a small soundproof room we'd converted from the old linen closet, each file carefully labeled and stored. We called it the living will, not legal, but binding in a deeper way. One afternoon, I recorded my own. I sat in front of the microphone, closed my eyes, and said the one thing I'd never been able to say before. My name is Rowena Hallberg. I was betrayed, but I lived, not because I was strong, but because I chose not to stay buried. I ended the recording, pressed save, walked out. Esther was waiting in the hallway. "You good?" she asked. "Better than that," I said. "I'm real." That night, as the sun dipped below the hill and painted the garden in shades of honey and fire, I watched Vivienne walk slowly toward the orchard gate. She didn't knock, just stood there, looking in. I thought about going to her, but I didn't, not yet. Instead, I turned to the tulips now fully in bloom and whispered, "She's watching." Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a hug. It arrives as permission to try again, or not. But it begins with the choice. And this time, the choice was mine. The women at Halberg House started calling me the matron, not as a joke, not entirely. It started with Miriam the poet, who said one night after dinner, "You don't just run this place, Rowena. You haunt it in the best way." "I'm not a ghost," I said. "No," she replied, sipping her tea. "You're the echo that brought us all home." It struck me more deeply than I let on, because in some way I had become a steward of stories. Not just my own, but theirs. Dozens of them now scrawled in journals, painted on canvases, murmured over chess games, sung softly under moonlight. Every woman here carried her own resurrection. Lena, who had once been institutionalized by her own son for delusions when she started painting again at 70. Dolores, whose daughter blocked her number after she came out as bisexual at 65. Ruth, who buried her voice in religion and spent 5 decades playing silent, obedient wife until her husband died and she started writing erotica under a pen name. They didn't need fixing. They needed witnesses. And that's what I offered. One afternoon, we received a letter from the local college. A young literature professor had heard about our archive and wanted to collaborate. She proposed a lecture series on the late bloomers, women who refused to fade. She asked if she could interview me. I said yes. The room was packed, mostly students, a few community members. One woman in the front row wore a vintage pin from the first play I ever directed. That pin had been out of print since 1983. I hadn't even seen one in decades. I took the stage slowly, feeling the wood under my heels, the velvet curtain behind me. The professor asked questions. I answered with honesty, not rehearsed drama, not sound bites. When she asked about the fake death, I simply said, "They wrote my ending for me." But I kept the pen. The room fell silent. I let it linger before continuing. "We talk a lot about legacy, but no one tells you legacy doesn't happen when you die. It happens when you refuse to disappear before your time." The applause came like thunder. And still, I felt the question hovering in the air, the one no one dared ask. What about Gregory and Vivienne? What now? The truth. They hadn't returned since the night they stood at the orchard gate. A few short letters came measured, restrained. Updates, reflections, no pleas for forgiveness. Just proof that they were still circling the fire they once tried to extinguish. And that was enough. For now. One day, as I prepared the guest house for a new resident, I found something in the drawer of an old dresser, a photograph I'd forgotten about. Me, Gregory, Vivienne. All 3 of us, laughing, caught mid-motion, sitting on the floor of the study surrounded by crumpled wrapping paper. Christmas 1994. We looked happy, not perfect, but whole. I ran my fingers across the image, then pinned it to the corkboard in the common room beside a photo of Dolores holding her first published book and Lena grinning in front of her latest mural. No caption, just faces, just proof that once things were better. And maybe if the universe allowed, some parts still could be. That evening, I walked through the orchard alone. The tulips had faded. The roses were blooming now. Esther found me by the trellis, arms folded, gaze tilted skyward. "You always come out here when you're thinking." "I'm not thinking," I said. "Oh, I'm remembering." She didn't press. She just stood beside me, our shadows long in the late light. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked after a while. "Yes," I said, "but not who they became. I miss the children who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers." She smiled. "They might come back, you know." "I hope so," I whispered. "But if not, I'll still be here." And I meant it, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer waiting to be loved the right way. I was simply loving the soil, the women, my stories. and myself. I didn't expect the call. It came on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day when the whole world feels like it's sighing. The wind rattled the glass in the conservatory, and I was midway through helping Dolores set up an exhibit of resident art when my cell phone buzzed softly in my pocket. The number was unfamiliar, but something in me knew. "Hello, Mom." It was Vivienne. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Not the polished, poised tone she used on stage, not the clipped syllables of her gala speeches. This voice was raw, frayed at the edges. "I don't want to ask for anything," she said quickly. "I'm not here to fix the past. I just wanted to say something." I stepped away from the room out into the hallway, my back against the cool stone wall. "I'm listening," I said. She took a breath so long I could hear it trembling through the line. "I watched your interview at the college. Twice. The part where you said, 'They wrote my ending for me, but I kept the pen.'" Silence. "I did that," she whispered. "I tried to write your ending, because I thought it would make mine easier." My throat tightened, but I didn't interrupt. "I was scared," she continued. "You were slipping, at least I thought you were. And the idea of being left behind again, like after Dad." I panicked. I saw the money as a solution, not a motive. "Do you understand that it was still betrayal?" I asked, calm but direct. "Yes," she said, "and it eats at me. Every day." She paused again. Then softly, "Can I come see the house?" "Not our house. The house." I closed my eyes. "You can visit," I said. "But the gate only opens to honesty. No stage. No performance." "I wouldn't come with either," she said. "Just me, as I am." The call ended there. No promises. No arrangements. Just a beginning. Again. 2 days later she came. Alone. No makeup. No designer coat. Just jeans, boots, and a rain-stained cardigan that looked like it had belonged to someone else before her. I didn't meet her at the gate. I waited on the porch, letting her walk the path herself. When she reached the steps, she looked up at me. The same eyes I'd stared into the night she was born. Now older, sadder, but open in a way I hadn't seen in decades. "I brought something," she said, reaching into her bag. She handed me a stack of printed photographs. Of Halberg House. From the early years. Me kneeling in the garden. Vivienne in pigtails holding a paintbrush as I laughed behind her. Gregory on the roof of the gazebo, hammer in hand, while I shouted at him to come down. "Where did you find these?" I whispered. "They were in Dad's old camera box. I didn't look until recently." I sat on the bench. She joined me, slow and careful, like sitting too fast might break the moment. "Why now?" I asked. Vivienne looked out at the garden. "Because grief doesn't end. It just waits for you to stop running." I nodded. We didn't hug, didn't cry, but we sat side by side in silence. And for now, that was enough. Later, as the sun dipped behind the orchard, she asked to see the archive room. I showed her. She walked through the shelves, quietly running her fingers along the spines of audio logs, bound memoirs, and framed letters. When she reached the section marked Rowena Halberg, she turned to me. "May I listen?" I hesitated, then nodded. She put on the headphones. I watched as she heard my voice speak back to her through time, through betrayal, through grief. "My name is Rowena Halberg. I was betrayed, but I lived, not because I was strong, but because I chose not to stay buried." When she removed the headphones, her eyes were red, but she didn't speak. She just walked over, took my hand, and kissed the back of it. The past wasn't erased. It was acknowledged. And the present. It was being rewritten. The next letter came from Gregory. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't dramatic. Just an email, plain and titled, "If you'll let me visit." In it, he didn't explain. Didn't justify. He just accounted. "I've started volunteering at a care home. I fix leaky sinks and play chess with men who used to lead banks and teach history and build cities. Men who get called buddy and pal because no one remembers their names. I'm starting to remember yours. Dad called you Ro when no one was listening. I never really asked what you wanted to be called. I'm sorry for that. And everything else. If it's all right, I'd like to bring tulips." I read it 3 times before replying. "Tulips are late this year, so you'd better not be." He came 2 days later. He parked by the orchard, wore the same navy coat he'd worn to court. except it looked looser now. Like it didn't fit anymore. Or maybe he didn't fit inside the life he'd made. He carried a small bouquet, yellow tulips, a ribbon around the stems. I wasn't sure what color, he said awkwardly. Yellow's good, I replied. Forgiveness wears yellow. He held them out. I took them, briefly, then passed them to Esther, who had appeared like smoke from the kitchen doorway watching measuring. I'll put them in water, she said, vanishing again. We walked in silence for a while past the rose beds and the swing Vivian helped repaint with Ruth last week. He paused by the garden wall. I was jealous of Vivian, he said unprompted. She always knew how to charm a room. I always felt like the extra child, the technician to her spotlight. You were never extra, I said. You were the one who built the stage. He looked at me then fully. You really believe that? I always did. And then, to my surprise, he sat on the ground, cross-legged, like a boy again, and just wept. I didn't rush to hold him, didn't try to fix it. I just sat down beside him, shoulder to shoulder, letting the earth soak up whatever needed to spill out of him. He cried like a man who didn't know he still could. When he was done, he pulled something from his pocket. A photo, the same one Vivian had given me Christmas 1994. Except this version had something written on the back. She laughed like she forgot what sorrow was. We should have asked what made her laugh. Vivian showed me the photo, he said. I had a copy too. Been carrying it around. Couldn't throw it away. I'm glad you didn't. He folded the picture again and looked up at the clouds. I still don't know how to undo it all, he said. You don't, I answered. You live better. We walked back toward the porch. Esther met us at the steps, holding out the vase of yellow tulips. She didn't say anything, just handed them to me. Guest room's made, she said to Gregory. I was hoping you'd say that, he replied quietly. That night, we ate together, me, Esther, Gregory, and Vivienne, who had returned earlier in the afternoon. Dolores joined us too. So did Ruth, who brought peach pie and her usual flair for awkward questions. Halfway through the meal, Ruth raised her glass. To the undead, she said cheerfully. Everyone laughed. Even Gregory. Even me. Afterward, we sat on the porch, the evening breeze soft and scented with jasmine. Gregory leaned back and asked, You think we'll ever earn it back? What? I asked. Your trust. I thought for a long moment before replying. You're not earning back who I was. She's gone. You're earning the right to know who I am now. He nodded quietly, accepting that truth. In the distance, the orchard swayed in the wind, whispering through the branches. And for once, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I felt like the roots, deep, unmoved, alive. The porch had become our quiet meeting place. No more courtroom tension, no more funeral echoes. Just long wooden planks, creaking chairs, and the space between words. Esther often brought 2 mugs chamomile for me, mint for herself, and left a third on the railing, in case someone else joined. Sometimes they did. Vivian began spending her Sundays in the garden helping Marcus plant snapdragons and bluebells. She didn't talk much, but her silence no longer felt defensive. It felt willing. Willing to listen. Willing to show up without asking for a scene. Gregory, on the other hand, gravitated toward the archive. He cataloged tapes, scanned journals, and occasionally sat in on recording sessions. He was particularly patient with Dolores, who liked to redo her audio every time she sneezed in the background. She called him Archivist Greg, and he didn't correct her. The house was full, but it no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a home. One morning, as I prepared breakfast, Gregory came into the kitchen holding a small wooden box. I found this in the attic, he said. Yours. I opened it. Inside was my old theater keychain, a cracked lipstick I hadn't used since the 90s, and a note I'd written myself long ago on the back of a stage stub. It read, If you forget who you are, direct something that reminds you. I smiled, then laughed. I must have left this after my last show, I said, when the curtain fell and I didn't know what came next. Gregory looked at me. And now I said, I'm the show. He nodded. Can I stay a while longer? He asked, quieter now. Not as your son, just as someone trying to be better. You don't need permission to be decent, I said. But the guest room's yours. Vivian joined us that afternoon with a tray of cookies she and Lena had baked. Be warned, she said. Lena forgot the sugar. Again. We ate them anyway. That evening, we gathered in the conservatory. All of us resident staff visitors sat in a wide circle as the sun set behind the orchard. I had planned a small ceremony, not a performance, a recognition. I stood in the center and spoke plainly. This place exists because I refuse to stay buried. But it continues because you chose to grow here with me. The room was still. Then Vivian stood. I used to think legacy was something you claimed, she said. Now I know it's something you earn by showing up even when you've broken everything. Gregory stood too. I thought silence was safer. But it's not. It just rots you from the inside. This house reminded me how to speak. Then Dolores' arms crossed. This house reminded me I was never the problem. And one by one they spoke. Not in rehearsed lines, but in truths that had waited too long. When it was over, I added one last thing. A few months ago, I said the dead don't speak. I was wrong. We speak every time we choose to live again. The room didn't erupt in applause. It exhaled, peacefully. Later that night, I returned to the archive. I opened my final entry. This is my last recording. Not because I have nothing left to say, but because I've said what matters. I lived through betrayal, silence, grief. I came back not to haunt anyone, but to remind them I never left. I forgave, but not to erase the past. I forgave to give the future something to stand on. And now I pass the pen. I clicked save. Closed the laptop. Outside, the wind rustled the tulips. A new season waited. And for once, I wasn't afraid to meet it. Word count. Wirkasede. End. Good luck. Now generating the 300-word poetic close to wrap the series. Final close 300 words. I came back from the dead, not because I wanted revenge, not because I needed to prove them wrong, but because there were still things I hadn't said, and things I refused to let them rewrite. They buried me in paperwork, in whispers, in greedy intentions masked as love. But I didn't rise to punish. I rose to witness, to walk through the ruins of what they thought I was, and reclaim the bones they mistook for dust. I found truth in quiet places, in a rose that still bloomed without praise, in a sister who never asked for repayment, in women who refused to go gentle into the small print of their stories. They called me matron, survivor, ghost, but I am none of those things. I am soil rich with what I've endured. I am fire kindled, not consumed. I am voice low, firm, and finally mine. To those who tried to silence me, I offer no stage, only the knowledge that I am still writing. To those who've been silenced, this house is yours. This moment is yours. This life, however fractured, is still yours. Come bloom where they buried you. Come speak where they shushed you. Come walk where they left you behind. Because resurrection isn't rising once. It's choosing again and again to not go quietly. And I've stopped whispering. I'm home, alive, and never leaving again.